For another edition of Things Bryan Kohberger doesn't like about prison. It's a long list, so get comfy. And I, for one, am delighted by it. I cannot get enough of the petty gripes that this bloodthirsty killer has ever since his ass was handed to him, and especially since he narrowly avoided a firing squad.
The courtroom was silent when the sentence was read. Not the dramatic kind of silence you see in movies, but the heavy, suffocating kind that fills a room when everyone knows something permanent has just happened. On July 23, 2025, Bryan Kohberger stood before a judge in Ada County, Idaho. He had already pleaded guilty. There would be no trial, no jury, no prolonged cross-examinations broadcast to the public. Just a final hearing and a decision that would define the rest of his life. He avoided the death penalty. But what he accepted instead was something that would never end: 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. When the judge delivered his remarks, the language was direct, unfiltered. He did not soften the impact of the crimes. He described them as grotesque, devastating, beyond redemption. The message was clear. Nothing about the acts committed could be separated from the person who committed them. Families sat nearby, listening. Some had pushed for a harsher outcome. Others wanted certainty above all else. The plea agreement closed the door on a trial, but it also closed the door on appeals, delays, and years of procedural uncertainty. And once the sentence was finalized, Kohberger was no longer a defendant moving through the court system. He was transferred into permanent confinement. Within hours, a vehicle transported him to the Idaho Maximum Security Institution in Kuna, Idaho, the state's most controlled correctional facility. This was not a general population prison. It was designed for the highest-risk inmates in Idaho's system. Every corridor monitored, every door remotely controlled, every movement logged. Inmates assigned to long-term restrictive housing live under strict separation from the general population. Movement requires restraints. Recreation is limited to secure outdoor enclosures. Showers are scheduled. Cells are approximately 6 by 9 feet, concrete, minimal furnishings, controlled access, no grass yards, no open social spaces, just concrete structures and razor wire. Kohberger was placed in restrictive housing, a unit where inmates are separated for safety, security, or both. The environment is intentionally structured to minimize interaction and reduce unpredictability. Within days of arrival, he began submitting formal complaints. Issues regarding commissary access, cell conditions, meal tray completeness. Each grievance followed institutional procedure. Some were addressed, others were denied. The complaints themselves were not unusual in a correctional environment, but their frequency in the early weeks drew attention. He had entered the system fully aware of how institutions function. As a doctoral candidate studying criminal behavior, he had spent years analyzing how offenders interact with structured systems of control. Now he was inside one, not as an observer but as a subject. In restrictive housing, time does not pass in the same way it does outside. Days are repetitive. Lighting follows schedule. Movement is limited. Sensory input is reduced. Researchers who study long-term isolation describe measurable psychological effects: heightened sensitivity to noise, difficulty distinguishing days, and gradual shifts in identity perception over extended periods. Kohberger's environment is designed to maintain security above all else. The facility operates under strict protocols. Communication is limited. Interaction is controlled. The structure is deliberate. The sentence he received removed the possibility of release. There will be no parole hearing in his future, no scheduled reassessment that could shorten his time. Life without parole means exactly that: confinement until death. For the families affected, the plea deal brought mixed reactions. Some expressed relief that a trial would not drag on for years. Others felt the absence of a capital trial denied them a process they believed was necessary for closure. Public statements reflected both perspectives: grief, frustration, and a search for finality in different forms. Inside the prison, however, there are no public reactions. There is routine: lock, count, movement, meal, lock again. Kohberger's life now exists within those parameters. The courtroom has fallen quiet. The decision has been made, and what happens next will not be measured in headlines but in years. Inside the walls of the Idaho Maximum Security Institution, the sentence does not echo, it settles. By the time Bryan Kohberger arrived in restrictive housing, the headlines had already begun to fade. Outside the prison, the case was transitioning from breaking news to legal history. Inside, nothing transitions. The routine begins and then repeats. He is housed in long-term restrictive housing, a unit designed for separation and constant supervision. Movement is controlled. Doors are operated remotely. Inmates do not handle locks. When they leave their cells, they do so in restraints and under escort. Recreation occurs in a secure outdoor enclosure, concrete walls, chain-link fencing, razor wire overhead, open sky above. His cell measures approximately 6 by 9 feet. Concrete floor, a bolted sink and toilet, a narrow door slot for meals. Lighting follows institutional schedule. Privacy is minimal. Silence is not guaranteed. In the early weeks, Kohberger submitted formal grievances. Commissary access had not yet been configured after his transfer. Meal trays were reported as incomplete on occasion. Ventilation noise became a concern. Requests for transfer to another block were filed and denied. Each complaint moved through procedure, reviewed and processed according to policy. This pattern, filing, review, denial, became part of his adjustment period. Correctional experts often note that inmates new to restrictive housing frequently attempt to assert control through formal channels. Grievance systems exist to protect rights within custody, but in high-security units, excessive focus on minor procedural issues can signal difficulty adapting to institutional structure. Within J-Block, communication occurs in limited ways. Sound travels through shared ventilation routes. Conversations may carry indirectly. The environment itself can become a channel of interaction. In such settings, attention from other inmates can intensify quickly, especially when a case has received national coverage. Kohberger's housing placement was reviewed during a formal hearing conducted by a committee within the Department of Correction. He was present. He requested continued individual recreation, separate movement through the facility, and consideration for different housing conditions. He acknowledged that media attention surrounding his case could fade over time, a factor that might reduce inmate harassment. The committee determined that his placement remained appropriate. Restrictive housing would continue. For many inmates, time inside such units becomes defined by structure. Wake-up procedures, meal distribution, recreation hour, lockdown, repeat. Researchers who study long-term isolation document several consistent effects: altered perception of time, increased sensitivity to environmental stimuli, and gradual psychological adaptation to repetitive conditions. The brain adjusts to limited input. Days begin to feel similar. Routine becomes the primary marker of progression. Kohberger's background makes this shift particularly notable. His academic focus centered on criminal behavior and institutional systems. He studied how offenders think, how environments influence decisions, how structures shape conduct. Now the structure is shaping him. There is no classroom, no research lab, no academic environment. Identity markers that once defined him, student, instructor, researcher, no longer apply. In restrictive housing, self-definition narrows to physical reality, location, schedule, compliance. The sentence he received does not have a release date. Life without parole removes the possibility of future adjustment hearings tied to release. His confinement is not temporary segregation awaiting transfer. It is permanent. For the victims' families, the plea agreement ended the uncertainty of trial. There would be no years of appeals or retrials. The state secured a guaranteed conviction and sentence. For some families, that certainty mattered. For others, the absence of a capital trial left unresolved emotions about how justice should look in a case of this magnitude. Both responses exist simultaneously. Inside the prison, however, the focus is not on public debate. It is on control, safety, and protocol. Each day in restrictive housing follows the same pattern: limited movement, limited interaction, structured recreation, restraints during transport, scheduled showers, controlled environment. Adaptation becomes the psychological task, not acceptance adaptation. Because in a unit designed for long-term separation, resistance to routine only increases friction. Over time, most inmates in restrictive housing learn that stability comes from minimizing conflict and following procedure consistently. The environment does not change, the inmate must. As weeks pass, the early complaints may decrease. The system settles into equilibrium. Attention from other inmates often declines as media coverage fades. Inside maximum security facilities, notoriety can be temporary, but the sentence is not. By the time the legal process reached its conclusion, the courtroom had already done its work. The plea was entered. The sentence was imposed. 4 life terms without the possibility of parole. The death penalty removed through negotiation. No trial, no jury verdict, just finality delivered in measured language. For the state, the agreement guaranteed a conviction and eliminated years of appeals that often follow capital trials. For the defense, it secured certainty, removing the risk of execution. For the victims' families, the outcome carried different meanings. Some expressed relief that the case would not stretch on indefinitely through court proceedings. Others felt that a trial would have provided a fuller public accounting of the evidence and a different form of closure. All of those perspectives exist within the same decision. Justice, in this case, did not arrive with spectacle. It arrived through paperwork and sentencing. Inside the Idaho Maximum Security Institution, Kohberger remains in long-term restrictive housing. His daily environment is structured around security protocols. Movement is controlled. Interaction is limited. Time is divided into regulated segments. Recreation occurs in secure enclosures. Restraints are used during transfers. The routine is consistent and predictable. Life without parole means exactly what it states. There is no scheduled release, no parole board hearing, no opportunity for conditional freedom. The sentence continues until natural death. In correctional psychology, long-term restrictive housing is often studied for its documented effects on perception, cognition, and emotional regulation. Extended isolation can influence how individuals experience time and identity. Days can begin to feel indistinguishable. Sensory input becomes limited. The brain adapts to reduced variation in environment. These adaptations are survival mechanisms within confinement. For Kohberger, this environment represents a complete reversal from his former academic path. The study of criminal behavior has given way to institutional control. The analyst has become the inmate. The observer is now fully inside the system he once examined from a distance. The broader community response reflects the complexity of high-profile sentencing. Some believe life without parole is appropriate and sufficient. Others argue that the absence of capital punishment changes the symbolic weight of justice in cases involving multiple victims. The plea agreement removed the uncertainty of trial, but it also removed the public presentation of evidence that a courtroom proceeding would have provided. What remains is the sentence: permanent confinement under maximum security supervision. There will be no parole review in the future, no reassessment tied to release eligibility. The legal outcome is final. For the families affected, healing is not determined by sentencing alone. Grief does not end when a case closes. Justice through the legal system addresses accountability. It does not erase loss. Those two realities coexist. And inside a concrete cell in J Block, the consequences of choice and consequence now unfold in the most literal way possible, one day at a time. The door locks each evening. It opens each morning. The schedule repeats. The environment remains constant. There is no dramatic ending inside maximum security confinement, only continuation. And perhaps the larger question this case leaves behind is not about guilt or sentencing, both of which are legally resolved, but about punishment itself. When a person chooses a plea that guarantees life without parole, is that outcome simply a different form of finality? Is permanent confinement a greater penalty than execution? Or does the answer depend entirely on how one defines justice? That is a question courts cannot universally answer. It is a question individuals must decide for themselves. Now I want to ask you, do you believe life without parole is the right outcome in this case? Or should the sentence have ended differently? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If this documentary-style breakdown gave you value, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth true crime coverage. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new case. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.